as Trump does in Agenda 47, to make America great again and to do it through peace, through strength, and so on, that does threaten a number of different kinds of violent conflict. Now, the situation I've been describing in many ways comes out of, but also challenges and possibly adds to or contradicts what are the kind of principal tenets of the traditional American foreign policy establishment, which I would argue dates back to Pearl Harbor, 1941. And I would identify three key, if you like, characteristics of that traditional foreign policy establishment, which I would argue in some way or other are now being challenged from within, most powerfully by Trump, but I would say from within the liberal internationalist camp as well, but in a different way. The first of the three characteristics of the American foreign policy establishment traditionally, I would argue, is constant economic expansion via open markets and globalization or internationalization. That has been a sort of powerful tendency throughout the period that we're talking about. Secondly, that this was to be done within an international system of institutions and laws, and that Bretton Woods system after 1945 was going to be the principal vehicle, the architect of that international order through which that economic expansion would largely take place. And the third, it would be underpinned by an ideology. My colleague who spoke first suggested that the United States has no ideology. I would argue it does. That is called American exceptionalism. And that idea that the United States is superior. It is has moral superiority, technical superiority, and that backed by military might. One of the key characteristics identified by those who study the history of American foreign policy, they argue, is that the Anglo-Saxon has been very powerful in building global governance, global institutions, and that is one of their kind of alleged exclusive superiorities. And I think that's embedded in that concept of American exceptionalism itself. And from those three characteristics, I would argue, flowed and interconnected with the composition of that traditional American foreign policy establishment. These were largely internationally oriented Wall Street banks, Wall Street finance houses, and corporations, big Wall Street law firms as well, but also philanthropic foundations like Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, very significant think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings, and others as well. The leadership of both main political parties in a bipartisan alliance stood for the same thing, and they were recruited from very similar kinds of people, largely East Coast social and economic elites, who some of them concentrated in Boston and known as the Boston Brahmins, for example, and dominant in the big Eastern universities, the Ivy League universities like Harvard and others as well, whose names appeared in the social register, who belonged to a kind of aristocracy which the US was never supposed to have, but which had developed by the late 19th century and was being educated in English-style elite private schools as well. But also they were armed with what they believed was sort of the new kind of best information and knowledge about the world, which was social scientific knowledge and expertise. They were technocratic, elitist, and top-down. They represented what Walter Lippmann called the secular priesthood. They were the new people who had the sort of tablets on which the truth was inscribed. They had a very low view of democracy, of the masses who were unruly and irrational, and so on. And they had a great idea about their own kind of a superiority as American elites themselves. And they were built in and forged by, as Godfrey Hodgson says in a very interesting article in the 1970s in Foreign Policy, they were built by war. They won wars like World War I, World War II, the Cold War, later by Korea, not so much in Vietnam, and that led to a bit of a debacle for them, but they came back from it. And that is to say that militarism, interventionism, regime change has been a fundamental part of American power and the foreign policy establishment since the 1940s. And since the end of the Cold War, in its own particular way, in a Soviet-free world, this kind of led to an explosion of large numbers of other conflicts, which we now call forever wars, which includes the war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Ukraine, Israel and Gaza, as we see it today. So I think what we see now is what I began with, which is there is a sense of, at the very least, transition and change, debate, possibly crisis in the American foreign policy establishment. And we can see this in a number of different tendencies which have become very strong in the last 8 to 10 years in particular. One, of course, is Trumpism itself, especially the relative transformation of the Heritage Foundation as a result of the power and influence of Donald Trump and his appeal. Trump may well be, for the Heritage Foundation, others who actually do think about the world in systematic ways, he may well be a blunt instrument, but he's a very effective blunt instrument for those who have a much more coherent worldview about the changing attitude of the United States to the way in which the world is changing. That would include foundations like Heritage, think tanks like Heritage, but possibly also Cato, but as well as the America First Policy Institute. But on the other side, we also have more progressive left kind voices as well, who are developing ideas about grand strategy, which have got more voice in the Democratic Party's kind of ecosystem as well. A recent book by Van Jackson in New Zealand about grand strategies on the left sums up the three principal schools within that particular tendency in the democratic environs as well. Thirdly, we have the Koch brothers, George Soros uneasy alliance, it would seem, from 2020 in the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And that, to my mind, suggests the two sort of the emerging voice of restraint alongside liberal internationalist hubris recognition as well, which has come from the Soros wing. But what it does suggest is that there's an exhaustion and a recognition that even among those who promote American democracy and so on and so forth, that they have gone far too far, and that has created more problems than it has resolved. And I would say there is probably a crisis within the core elements of the liberal internationalist heart of the American foreign policy establishment. And that was brought home most to me in the last few weeks or so in reading an article by the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, which publishes foreign affairs, as you know, where he argues about the Ukraine crisis as being negotiable with Russia and giving up a large amount of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea and the Donbass and others, where he argues, do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That is to say, the president of the CFR, which is a kind of mainstay of liberal internationalism and so on, is actually talking about negotiating with Russia for various kinds of reasons. So that is to say, there's a number of different tendencies and schools which are jangling against each other, but which also have some overlaps with each other. So we're not necessarily talking about a breakdown of the establishment, but we're certainly talking about a bit more kind of pluralism within it. But you should be aware that Trumpism has not given up on American global dominance. It has not given up on American primacy. It has not given up on military supremacy. It has not given up on Israel. It is not giving up on its struggle against China. And it has not given up on the European Union. And that reflects a large number of factors, including a kind of a factor which is not necessarily taken seriously by a large number of scholars who study American foreign policy, but there is a very strongly racialized element of the ideology of American exceptionalism and American power too, which sees a kind of natural relationship with the EU and Europe, Western Europe in particular, even if there is competition, even if there are disagreements between them, just as there were between the Anglo-Saxon powers of Britain and the United States, there remain a kind of underlying sense of special relations, which are sort of racialized relations, which I'd argue, which then binds together to some extent too. So when we look at the Trump elite, and the people who've studied the Trump elite, those who were appointed in 2017, then the very large amount of turnover by 2019 and what it looked like in 2019, and the little bits I've done since he won the election a few weeks ago, and the people he's appointed, and the people he's nominated for his next cabinet and other appointments, what we see is a far more independently minded Donald Trump, far more wedded to not only personalism and personal loyalty, but also much more to make America great again. There may well be some overlaps in some of the appointments with some of the more traditional elements of the kind of American foreign policy elites, but there's a large number of other people who are actually far more committed ideologically as opposed to coming out of that particular kind of system. So the ones that he's appointing, and the Republican Party in general, for all its disagreements between themselves, and including the three tribes in the GOP's foreign policy camps, which I'm going to describe in a minute, they are basically pro-MAGA. That is, anti-immigration is something they all agree on. Problems of globalization, tariffs as an answer, anti-free trade, opposition to climate change, and so on, being underemphasized, and the China threat, and a new relationship sought with it, unites them. But there are three main tribes, no problem. 1 minute per tribe. There are three main tribes that the European Council on Foreign Relations in a recent article identified, and I think it looks quite interesting as a kind of a typology. One is primacists, and they're the closest to the traditional foreign policy establishment. They believe in world hegemony, NATO, backing Ukraine fully to the hilt, and to some extent, Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, his national security advisor pick, probably are closest to that particular grouping. So that is to say, although Trump talks a lot about the deep state and the swamp and so on, he's not fully abandoning and jettisoning it, because Trumpism is an extension of some elements which never fully died, even after 1941. That America First might have wound up in 1941 after Pearl Harbor, but America Firstism never really fully went away, but it was marginalized. And we've seen Patrick Buchanan in the 1990s talking a large part of the things which Trump is still saying. That is to say, it's not a break, but there is something quite interesting and different. Second group, the second tribe, could be called prioritizers. That is to say, they don't believe that America can fight so many wars simultaneously in the East, with Russia and with China in the Far East and so on. You've got to focus a lot more. That is to say, focus on the Ukraine, less on the Ukraine and the Middle East, and a lot more. Let Europe do what it does. Focus a lot more on the Indo-Pacific. The third group are called, in this article, restrainers. Their argument is focus a lot more on domestic issues, more military restraint. Let's take care of the Indo-Pacific and the China threat as a priority, and leave the rest to it. Those are the kind of different voices that some people have identified, which are jangling for position within the Republican Party ecosystem of think tanks and foundations and other kinds of organizations. And that is the kind of milieu from which Trump's policies will likely impact. There are people in this room who know a lot more about Israel, about the Gulf, the Middle East than I do, and I'm not going to go into that territory. I'm probably in enough trouble as it is. But that's, I think there's something there perhaps for people to think about.
Thank you, Dr. Parmar, for sharing your perspectives. And it's nice, being outside of Washington and hearing a bird's eye view about foreign policy. We're usually